Welcome, everyone, to the C-Suite Sales and Marketing Perspectives podcast. I'm Steve McDonald, your host. And today we have a very interesting guest, Vidhya Srinivasan. And Vidhya, you are the Chief Product and Marketing Officer at Magnit. And you've got an interesting background. So you've got a product marketing background and an engineering background that you bring together. You've got a really interesting personal background. You live in Colorado, and of the 52 14ers, you've climbed 13 of them. And you have a trip planned to Kilimanjaro. So that's a very outgoing personality. And I'm sure you bring that to the business too. I'd love to, before we get started here, and our topic today is that our land and expand strategy is broken. And we're going to talk a lot more about what that means and what that is. But before we do that, if you wouldn't mind just explaining a little bit more about your background.
Sure. Thanks, Steve, for having me. Very excited to be here and discuss land and expand strategy. It's always the fun part of go-to-market for any company. Yeah, just a bit brief background. Like you said, I've done many roles across the organization, from started as an engineer a long time ago, evolved into product management, and somewhere along the line got really excited about storytelling, and which took me into marketing. So I think my USP is really the intersection of product marketing and engineering, and the ability to collaborate and work across the various functions to really help customers with a go-to-market strategy. At the end of the day, it's all about how do we help customers through the journey and make them successful. And I think my background certainly helps me drive that value to organizations and ultimately to customers in the process of value creation. Personally, I'm a mom, a wife, and yeah, my husband and I do love hiking. I went to college in Colorado, so certainly a place close to our hearts. I went to CU. My husband went to CSU. So from a football perspective, it's a pretty interesting contrast between us. But yeah, we like hiking, and we're excited about potentially a trip to climbing Kilimanjaro in a couple of years after we get acclimated to that as a preparation.
Well, fantastic. Let's talk about why the land and expand strategy is broken. So one of the things that CMOs that we know is that we have to be very pipeline driven. And one of the things that's interesting about creating new annual revenue, Forrester came out with a study a couple of years ago, and they identified that 73% of new annual revenue actually comes from existing clients. But we spend about 98% of the time focused on new logo development. So that's one thing, the amount of time and effort that we're putting in one direction versus the other. The other one is that it's getting harder and harder to conquest new logos. And we all know that it's 5 times easier, whatever the stat is, right, on expanding an existing client relationship. But one of the biggest reasons is the buyer today, the B2B buyer, is waiting longer and longer to even want to talk to us, right? And they've already picked their top 2 or 3. They mentally know who their winner is, and then they're talking to the organizations. And I think a big part of that is because of the loss of trust. And we're the selling organization. We're definitely going to put ourselves into the best light. And there was another study that came out just over a year ago that identified that 74% of B2B buyers, 74%, don't believe the customer evidence that we presented them. So it's getting harder and harder to conquest new logos. And what I just wanted to do is I wanted to talk to you about, as a CMO and a C-level executive in the organization, we've got to confront this B2B trust gap, right, head on. And just how do you think about that, and how do you approach that in your business?
Yeah, it's very interesting. I think most of the companies today actually go through this sort of balance in figuring out new logo versus the land versus the expand strategy. I think I'll start with the second part of your question, which is really the trust factor, because it's a critical part of whether it's a cross-sell or a land aspect in making sure customers have trust in your brand, in who you are, and what you can offer for them. So I think I don't want to show my age in this process, but 20 years ago, right, if you had asked, the sale process was very much a relationship, right? You went to the customer side, you built that relationship and worked to build that trust so that you would be awarded the opportunity to deliver value for the customers. But I think over the past 10, 12 years, I think this notion of meeting the customers where they are, meeting the prospects where they are is certainly a big part of how the things have evolved. And as a result, I think a big part of these tools like G2 Crowd, people know about that, right? There's IT Central Station for IT software decisions. And there's obviously big analyst firms like the Gartners, Forresters of the world, who have the customer voice represented in what they share with the buyers in the industry. So I think that's a big testament to customers or buyers or prospects, however you think about them, really leaning on their peers and what some of these big analysts are talking about and the direction of the outside in perspective as opposed to just listening to the companies trying to sell you stuff. So I think the peer to peer is certainly a very powerful phenomenon that just happened right over the past 10 years that I think has changed the way we engage the prospect, changed the way we engage the customer. So digital marketing is certainly a big part of that growth, is leveraging tools like the sixth sense, right? So knowing what the intent is of the buyer and being able to leverage those insights to be able to approach them where they are. So I think that's a big part of the reason why traditional approach to selling and marketing is not going to work, right? You got to meet the buyers and customers where they are in the journey that they are in. That's number one. I think the balance of the land and expand or new logos versus cross sell, I think it's important that every company, every organization has this notion of new logos because obviously you want to show the growth in your customer base, your install base. But at the same time, I think the prioritization and balance of what that is going to be year after year needs to be thought about from a true customer retention and expansion of that customer trust, advocacy, right? Even more a contributor for the company's success than just a new logo. So I think I could go on for another 10 minutes about this, but it's really important that people don't think about just landing because the company's job doesn't end when you land the customer. So it's not just a buyer's journey. It needs to immediately transcend into a customer journey. And that's where I think companies are struggling because they think of it as, oh, I've landed. That's the buyer's journey. I've caught them. And you end up being a shelf software and not knowing whether they've used it, not really giving them the value creation that they were expecting. And you lose the trust in that process a little bit. So yeah, I'll pause there because I think it is a very important balance that customers need to strike and not very well done in many organizations today because the focus is the land strategy for the most part.
You're right. There's so many things that once we have certain KPIs set, it drives business activities. And the KPI, one of the biggest ones in most organizations is how do we bring in more new clients, right? How do we build our pipeline? That's what our executive team meetings, our sales meetings, our marketing meetings with sales, everything is all geared around how do we get more people in and close more deals in the pipeline, right? So that drives activity. But you had you had a bunch of really good points, but I wrote down two in particular that I wanted to ask you about. The first one was that we can get lost behind the numbers. We have so much overly familiar with our clients, but we don't get deep understanding of them. And you went back a couple of decades to when we actually talked. We talked to customers. And a lot of CMOs, as soon as they come on board, the first thing they'll do is they'll get on and they will talk to 10, 15, 20, 25 different customers because it's not a sales environment. It's a deep learning environment. But we can't keep that up because there's so much to do. So it ends up falling by the wayside. So this idea that we actually have to talk with our ICP, we have to understand them. And so here's, I want to get your opinion on this, is that most companies feel like they talk to prospects and customers all the time. They've got a sales group, they've got a customer success group. But Gong came out with a study and they said that literally the sales rep, and this is after analyzing thousands of sales calls, talks 2/3 to 3/4 of the time. It's not a deep listening environment because then the prospect is talking about what the sales rep was introducing. And there's a shield up there. we're being sold to. So we're not unloading and unleashing and under divulging our big challenges. And we're there to learn, right? And reveal as little as we can as the buyer. And on the customer success side, our priority is lots of times putting out fires, answering questions, and cross-selling and upselling. A sales environment, again, you would never say, I'm going to design a customer conversation, a deep listening program, and run it through processes that, guess what, have something totally different in mind in terms of their original design. So how do we get these conversations? Like, how do we enable that to happen in our business?
I think this is a very close to heart conversation for me because I think this is the conversion from the buyer's journey conversation to the customer journey conversation. Again, if you look at companies who do this well, there's this notion of value based selling. And when that happens, this notion of customer journey kicks in right at the point of sale, or you start talking about, okay, customer, let me talk to you about what this journey is going to be working with us. And you talk about the maturity, right? And how we get them to really driving the value that we told you we would working with you, right? So that's the value based selling, but then it should evolve into value creation, right? For the customer. So I think the way, the successful companies have the right roles and KPIs and accountability across few key roles. I would say from a sales perspective, how you comp the salespeople, not just at the point of sale, but the success of the customer and the journey. So how you comp them over the course of that period is critical. And then having the right account reps and the CSMs, customer success managers, in the process to really help with that maturity for them to get to what we sold them the value to be, I think is even more important. So the conversations are not just at the point of sale and the point of renewal, because most of the companies, they forget it. And it's 2 points and it's 6 months before renewal. Everybody kind of gets into this very anxiety mode trying to say, oh, we need to. But then half the time you find that the customer really didn't get the value that we promised at some point during the point of sale. So I think those are probably the critical roles, like from a CSM to an account rep and the collaboration across sales and the customer success or customer service functions that needs to happen, and the marketing component where we can come in and really help do customer marketing, right? We talked about demand gen and prospects and all of that stuff. Now we really need to tell the customer with the right testimonials, peer reviews, working, saying, hey, you're a customer in this industry. We know another customer who has done the same thing. Why don't we help you sort of talk to them? So there's an aspect of it, advocacy and building trust through customer marketing that you could do. And also tell the customer, hey, by the way, you are here, but in order for you to get to this level of maturity, here are some additional capabilities that's available to you. Did you know we can help you? So that's where the customer marketing function could really connect the dots across these and be more of a neutral party, to be honest, and not be the person being seen as selling to the customer, but really sharing and bringing in the right people to share peer reviews or best practices as another customer with them, right? So that's where some of these things have to come together, but that will come together if you think about this as the customer journey with all of us helping every part of that journey as opposed to the point of sale and renewal. So I think that needs to happen.
There was a chief customer success officer, actually from an enterprise company that came onto the podcast. And she said, Steve, she was doing exactly what you're talking about. The whole goal was how do we support, how do we help, how do we add value to the existing customer relationship? She said to the point where they would call us up just to spitball ideas, just to run things by us, right? And she said, the people on my customer success team, they had attributed to them an annual $2 million in new revenue. The sales team had annually attributed to them an additional $200,000 in ARR. What a difference. And this idea, again, going back to the land and expand, we have a tremendous opportunity to expand. We have a tremendous opportunity to create those relationships with our customers, right? And there shouldn't be a CFO or a CEO out there that isn't in the SaaS world, that isn't looking at NRR, recurring revenue. And like, how do we get that number up? And that is, how do you do that? It's through the success of your own customers. Everything that we're talking about here, it comes right back to the basic financials of building a long-term sustainable business. And that was something I wanted to ask you too, because we tend to work in short cycles. Markets have reward short-term success. And the way that our sales team is usually set up, it's like quarterly quotas. Like, you go to the board meetings, and one of the very first things they talked about is, how's this quarter turning out? What's next quarter look like? So you had a very specific opinion about how we need to start changing that dynamic internally and resetting expectations that have a bit longer horizon, and why. I just wanted to ask you about that.
At some point, we all turn into this coin operated machine, right? So it boils down to the comp and what are we incentivized by? And again, it comes to some of these core functions within the organization, like salespeople. It's not the point of sale. They are not going to be comped just for booking a $2 million deal. Their compensation needs to align to the customer success in some form. So I think really thinking about the comp structure and the incentivization of not just the sales team or the CSMs or CS teams, but also like, how can we bring marketing to be accountable, right? To do certain things, because there are a lot of functions that we don't really think about in terms of accountability. Because when you think of bookings, you think about sales. And when you think of expansions, usually you think about, okay, it's the CS team, right? Or the account reps who focused on renewals. So I think there is probably more accountability that could be shared for the organization and the functions within the organization to work closely for joint success and ultimately better value for customer and customer success. So I think there is an aspect of, we need to start thinking differently in sort of the incentives and the comp models. So that's number one. I think the second part is really figuring out from a customer perspective, the trust aspects, because it's not just us saying what we are going to do for the customer, but how do we build sort of customer testimonials, right? As an example, this has happened many times over the years in my career. You have a contract that's redlined so many times across the customer and you. The net is, you do have the aspect of saying, okay, customer, if we deliver value to you, you will agree to be a customer testimonial for us, right? Or a reference for us. And most of the time, the process, it's X'd out, right? Because people don't want to say it, because sales says, I just want to close this deal. I don't want to deal with this. But I think those are things that happen in the sales process where sales is, how can I close this deal ASAP so I can show success? So I think the sentiment and the behavioral patterns that happen, and I'm sure every CMO or every salesperson will probably listen to this and say, I know this happens every day to me. So I think the customer trust part, which is where we started, right, can only be validated by the customer, and the ability for us to be in a place where a customer volunteers and wants to be your voice, represent your company, is something that's truly important for customers to get there. If you think about companies like ServiceNow or Salesforce, think about that. The reason they're great is because any customer working with them would be willing to, at any point in time, get on a plane, come to something. So I think the aspect of incentives, again, thinking about it broadly, is how can marketing be made accountable? How can CS be made accountable? How can finance be made accountable? Because we do have pricing conversations where finance comes to the table, right? There's a deal go, no go aspect of things. So I think all of those aspects need to be thought through by companies and not just go back to saying, okay, we need a pipeline from marketing. Sales is going to close the deal and then put it over the wall and it's CS's problem. That needs to completely be demolished and really thought through. It's four people going together across four different functions with success. That's joint success. and goals that are MBOs, right? Business objectives that all those executives are agreeing to.
One of the things you said in there was that these silos, right? It goes from marketing create leads, they go over to sales. It's this handoff. It's like a baton race, right? And then the deal closes and the baton passes over to customer success. And I had on the podcast a gentleman who's a CRO and his CMO, and he was CRO of the year last year. And he said, we just did away with that. Exactly what you're talking about. He said, we are no longer compensated in the sales department for closing deals. And marketing is actually compensated for deals that close and go into customer success, right? There is very much a long-term perspective. And they also focused very heavily. They said that their company culture was over 50% of their success because they talked about how we attract the right people and we retain the right people when we have a very strong, healthy company culture. And they went into that in big ways. But we all know this is a relationship-based business. And you talked about coming together as a team. This is what reminded me of this, to bring this up, and this idea of a culture. Like there has to be an environment where the team can come together, is incentivized to come together. There's not a fear of failure. There's emotional security, right? We're all in this together. And departments actually erode that because you're a part of them. And this company had done a very good job of tearing those departmental walls down. And when you started talking about this, that's what came to my mind, is coming together as one team.
Yeah, we have to erase this notion of a CYA culture, and we have to check ego out the door, right? When we come to work, because at the end of the day, we are all trying to hit the same goal. We just have different roles to play in getting there. So I think it's very important. Culture eats strategy for breakfast. That's a golden saying, right? To me. And it's important that the culture unites us and not makes us worry about, okay, who's the star of the show? It's not us, the star of the show. The star of the show should always be the customer and the outcome we are driving, right? So I think really making sure that, as I said, it's really the intent is to say, how do we come together as one team and help drive success for the company, but ultimately be united in driving the customer transformation journey is where I think the fun should be for anybody invested in driving value.
So I have another question, and that question is, we've covered a lot in the podcast, but if there was, for the C-suite, B2B C-suite audience that's watching this podcast, if there was one takeaway that you wanted them to have, what would that be?
I think definitely play an important part in influencing a culture of collaboration to drive the goals for the year. I think it's important. I'm just generalizing as goals for the year, but we all know when we think about, I'm a marketer at heart, you're thinking about targets for the year. We are always thinking about how are we going to get there, and really influencing that culture as C-level people. We all have the power to do that. And that starts with us to ensure that we check ego at the door and figure out, okay, I don't care who's taking credit for what. At the end of the day, we just need to come together and get this done. So I think that's a big part. And we all need to lead by example and work at that C-level. And then the second part, I would say, I know you asked me for one, I think that's an important one, but the second subset of that is really the teams, how we really set the goals for the teams is going to be a big part of it, because as we all know, coin operated is how things happen, even though we don't want to say that's how we operate. People go back to say, that's how my bonus gets given to me. So that's how they're going to be. So really thinking about the comp and goals for your organization and what success means that drives the joint goal is a very important aspect of what we need to think about in that process.
You brought it back up again, the culture aspect. I'm so glad that you did. There was a CISO, so Chief Information Security Officer, and he said, when I take on a new role, the number one thing I do is assess the team's culture.
Yeah.
He said, it's more important how we make decisions as a team than the actual decision itself. because he knows you're going to keep the highest performing people if they're engaged, they're collaborative, they feel their voice is heard, they're not afraid of making recommendations, they're not afraid of saying, I don't know, that's a good idea, even if it's you. It came from you, the chief information security officer. It's that kind of environment that you're talking about. So I think it's a great way to end this episode in terms of a takeaway is breaking down barriers, breaking down silo teams and bringing us together as one team and one common objective, because we do have one customer and they are the highest authority in the business. So we do have a very focused goal that we can come around. I'm really sure that there's going to be additional questions that people have. Would it be appropriate that I gave out a link to your LinkedIn profile so that they could reach out to you if they had questions?
Absolutely. Anytime.
Fantastic. The mission of this podcast is to bring C-suite perspectives together on macro issues that are facing our long-term growth and sustainability as organizations. And I just want to say thank you for helping create that mission here today. I really appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure. And thanks for having me, Steve. It was fun talking about, as I said, one of my favorite topics that I live every day, I feel like. But thank you for having me. Appreciate it.